Hello and welcome to this, which is the first episode in a brand new series on exploring practical survival for non-survivalists. And in this series we're going to explore the sort of scenarios you might find yourself when you're out in the UK and how to deal with those typical kind of scenarios. Now, because this is aimed at non-survivalists and non-preppers, we won't be mentioning a complete collapse of society, and there won't even be a whiff of a government conspiracy. This is just going to be pure, practical and simple advice for regular folk who enjoy using the countryside. And this episode is all about setting the scene and talking about the sort of scenarios you could find yourself in when you're out and about in the UK. Now, the reality is that as a country, we're just not that wild. In England and Wales, we're never further than 3 miles from a road, and even in the depths of Scotland, you're never further than 6 miles from a road. We're also really densely populated, and in the most sparsely populated region of the UK, which is in Cumbria, there are 26 people per square kilometre. To put that into perspective, that means if you look at a standard sized football pitch, you've got 5 people on there. So we're never really that far from help, and the end result of this means most survival scenarios you find yourself in the UK, they're going to be very short-lived and over within a few hours to 24 hours. Now, yes, some survival situations have gone on longer than that, but even in the depths of Scotland, it's rare for that to go over 2 days. So we really are looking at that short-term scenario. And while that may be very comforting, we've got to tell you that, that is still plenty of time to find yourself in a real life or death situation. Most scenarios you can find yourself in the UK are going to be down to a couple of things. Now, the most common one is a navigation error. That's just where you've gotten lost, you don't know how to get back to where you come from or where you were going, and you're having to spend out longer than you anticipated, and as a result you're exposed to the elements, perhaps having to overnight when you weren't prepared for it. Another common reason is a first aid incident or a medical emergency, and then you're unable to walk out as a result, or that first aid incident is kind of life-threatening on its own and need to be dealt with on site. Another common one is if you've got sort of an extreme weather event. For example, you've got sort of fog or wind or extreme rain that actually makes moving treacherous, so you need to kind of shelter in place, and again you're exposed to the elements for longer than you anticipated. You've also got kind of other common scenarios where you weren't intending to be out at all. For example, maybe you're travelling in your car, you've had a collision or you've been stranded because of a breakdown, and as a result you're left outside overnight waiting for help. Maybe you can't get a signal to actually call for a tow truck, and then you're having to stay with your vehicle overnight. So all of these things can cause you to be outside and put you in that life or death situation, and you need to have the skills to survive that. And the great news is, because all of those scenarios are going to be relatively short term, with just a little bit of skill and a little bit of preparation, we can reasonably expect to come through those pretty much unscathed. Now, if you read any survival book at all, they'll probably mention something called the 3 rules. And that is, you can survive 3 minutes without air, about 3 hours without shelter in extreme conditions, up to 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. And because we know that our scenarios are going to be relatively short term, we can prioritise and say that our real kind of focus needs to be on shelter from the elements, because we're in that kind of window where even if we don't have water, the likelihood is that sort of survival scenario is going to be over before that becomes a factor in your typical kind of UK scenario. I will actually include water as well, because it does make your time a lot more comfortable if you do have to do that, but usually it's not going to be a factor. We really do need to focus on shelter. And in this episode we also need to highlight the difference between the fantasy and the reality of surviving a typical kind of scenario that you might find yourself in the UK. Now, lots of people have this idea that survival is all about catching squirrels and rabbits and learning how to snare them and eat them, building shelter from natural materials and making clothes from kind of vegetation and things like that. And while all those primitive kind of bushcraft skills are commendable and they are really useful in a kind of collapse of society, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about being outdoors longer than you intended to, for maybe a couple of days at most. So with a little bit of preparation and bringing a little bit of minimum kit with you, you can change your situation and make it a lot easier. And in a true survival situation, you don't get any extra brownie points for rubbing 2 sticks together What you want is something that is fast, something that is easy, and something that is very reliable. And that's why we advocate bringing a few items with you and learning how to use them. In the next episode, I'll be looking at the sort of equipment that I carry to deal with this kind of scenario, and over the course of the series, we'll be covering the following topics. Now, if you don't want to miss that episode or any of the others in future, then please hit subscribe, ring the bell icon, and I will see you next time.